All right, today we are talking about Mesopotamian society, which I think is really interesting, and there's lots of fun things to kind of look at, especially because you think about, right, this is the first civilization, and we're going to talk about the definition of civilization in just a minute. Egypt's on its heels. Egypt comes in right after Mesopotamia, so they didn't win by much, but they still were this first civilization, and really especially Mesopotamia and Egypt, if you're going to combine the two and think about these two very early civilizations that were pretty close together geographically, and yet so different because of the geography and just how they structured their civilization, their society, their belief systems, the development of kingship, the literature that Mesopotamia puts out. So that's one of the things that you'll see is really different. Mesopotamia has a lot of interesting, fun stories, and then you go to Egypt and you're like, okay, it's incantations and spells, and then a few edicts and a letter to a son that was put on stone for everyone to see. Which I always think how I don't know, what narcissistic is it really? I'm not sure, but how egotistical, there we go, do you have to be to go, you know what, guys, I'm gonna write a letter to my children, but I know what I have to say in this letter is so important that, it just would be a disgrace to just let my son see it. No. You know what? I'm gonna chisel it into stone, so that everyone, for future generations, can appreciate my amazing, thoughts, my awesomeness. Because it has to be. One of the things we'll see with that when we get to that one in Egypt is that, while it was technically a letter to his son, it was meant to be preserved for other people to see and read, which means it was meant to be more of a public document than just a private one. But I always do wonder about that when you think about, and some it's more deserved. You think about with Augustus in Rome, he does the Res Gestae, where he has a list of all of his accomplishments near the end of his life, and okay, yeah, you started the Roman Empire and you did a ton of things. This guy was not a pharaoh. He was a vizier, so he still was high status, but it's still just kind of funny to me in the sense of yeah, I totally have valuable things to say. I'll have to. I thought about, I collect diaries sometimes from the 1930s, 1920s, whenever I can get my hands on them from any age, really. And it'd be like, yeah, none of those people wrote those diaries thinking someone else would read them. But it'd be funny to write a diary with the intent of hoping it lasted and someone hundreds of years from now, or 100 years from now even, decided to collect this thing, but just totally screw with them and write a whole bunch of random stuff about what daily life was like. Anyway, slightly off topic, I'm sorry, but that's what we're going to be looking at today. Before we get into the questions of what I want you to kind of consider as we're going through the lecture, I just wanted to show you the map of where we're at. So we are going to be looking at Mesopotamia right here, and then you have the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so, Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers. If it's between two rivers, but it's also sometimes said the land between two rivers, because that's where the majority of the various kingdoms that emerged were situated in here. And you can see that with Uruk was the first city, the first official, by definition, city versus, town. It's size, population size really makes the difference of an urban center versus almost urban center. It's nitpicking slightly, but Uruk is technically the first city. They reached that population goal. And then Ur, Nippur, Kish, and this doesn't even show all of them, but if you notice, they're either just outside or in the middle, and there's lots of other ones up here. I think that show in the next slide. And then you have Egypt over here, right? So what I'm talking about geographically pretty close, right? You have Mesopotamia here, Egypt here. They're not that far away. And then you have what's called the Fertile Crescent, which is following the waterways, right? So you've got the Nile, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the Mediterranean Sea. And so not surprisingly, this area, because this is desert, right? Things are not growing there. So where you're actually having a fertile area region where you can grow is going to be between or right outside the rivers. And then by water, it's by water sources, right? So all of the Nile, all along the Mediterranean Sea, and then all along the rivers there. And because it creates this kind of shape loosely, it's a crescent shape, you get the fertile,
I didn't get that.
Well,
could you try?
No, Siri. You get the Fertile Crescent. Sorry about that. You're probably gonna hear my dog too. I apologize. She insisted on coming with me to record, but apparently Siri needed to butt in as well. So yeah, it's shaped like a crescent, and so you get the Fertile Crescent is the name of it. And then here, this map just shows some of the empires. And to give you somewhat of an idea, it's not all of them. Sumer, right? You're having the Sumerian city-states were some of the earliest right here that developed. And then the Akkadian Empire came next. So the Sumer, or the Sumerian city-states, was not like an empire. They were independent city-states. But then you had the Akkadian Empire, which was with Akkad, which was a city-state that then under Sargon, and we'll look at this, takes over and creates the first real kind of kingdom or empire, or not kingdom, but like kingdom over other kings or empire of Mesopotamia. And then that kind of kickstarts off other empires taking over later. It was not successful before the Akkadian Empire under Sargon. So that gives you an idea, but you can see several more city-states, right? Mari, later Nineveh and Ashur, which is part of the Assyrian Empire, which we'll talk about in a separate lecture. So yeah, that's the region of Mesopotamia, and then we'll come back to Egypt after. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So let's look at the questions that I want you to consider in this lecture. The first is, what was the significance about the components of civilization, which we're going to look at first. What was the development of writing? And there's several phases of that. What was the early structure of Mesopotamian government, and how did it shift to kingship? How did the various rulers discussed represent good or bad kings based on Mesopotamian values of kingship? What was the importance of Hammurabi's law codes, and how did the transformation of religious beliefs reflect the geography and political structure? So first, let's just look at what becomes the components of civilization, right? If we do this, we'll do a little chart for this of, what are the kind of key things that you need to fit the proper definition. And now this is important. We tend to use the word civilized as meaning more advanced or proper, and especially when we contrast it to barbarian, as one who's not. Actually, the word barbarian comes from the Greeks, which they believe that kind of anyone that didn't speak Greek, their language sounded like bar, which is where you get barbarian. So we, like I said, that the name is just basically from the Greeks mocking other people speaking, is where we get that word. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're not looking at civilization as if somehow superior to a society that's not, doesn't qualify in some way. It's just different. It's basically, they just are fitting those components. And hopefully when we put these out here in a minute, you'll notice how Jarmo, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük each were having more and more of these components, because that was the point, that those three societies were within each one were slowly gaining more components of civilization until, right, Uruk ultimately ends up having all of them. And so that's just more like looking at in a historical component. Here are the things that we generally say are what you're looking for if you wanted to say, is this a civilization? Or why we say Uruk is a civilization and Mesopotamia first, because they fit all these components. It's somewhat arbitrary because it's decided upon by people later on of what makes up a civilization, but just don't get it confused with like the word civilized in terms of this kind of superior ideal or value. That's not what it represents. So the first thing is agriculture. Agriculture is necessary for civilization, except for, there's an exception, the Mongols. The Mongols get to be the exception to the rule. You have to have some form of farming for subsistence. We're going to look at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and then the Minoans that their main commodity wasn't agriculture like all these other societies, but they still had it. The Mongols, because they were nomadic, which leads to the second part, is what agriculture leads directly to sedentary life. And you really need to be sedentary to be a civilization, except for the Mongols, who were much more nomadic, but because they were so massive and they used other people's labor for these kind of components, they get classified as a civilization because they had everything else. But that, it's the one exception to the rule. And so you have to have some form of it, even if it isn't your major component, your most significant. Like I said, as we'll see with the Minoans and Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, they have it, but they also use trade as their major source versus almost all the other societies we're looking at. Agriculture is their main source. So it leads to sedentary life, right? You stay put. This is super important because it's going to lead to the next one, which is, and I'm going to number these. Some of this is loosely numbered because, so this is just to give you a sense of order. Technically, agriculture does need to come first to have urban centers, but I'm going to get into some where technically, depending on each civilization, it's not always the exact order. Like, for example, I'm going to get to organized religion. If I put that 6 in some societies, that could have come first, okay? So just know this is the loose order of things and kind of how they had a domino effect. So sedentary life, and agriculture, what it allows to have happen is that you are end up being able to have one person supported by, not one person, sorry, 100 people. It's the opposite of that. It's like, that's not right. 100 people are supported by 1 square mile. Remember, in hunting and gathering, it was one person required 1 to 2.5 square miles of land to support them. So this is a massive difference. We've just reversed it essentially in the sense of instead of one person for 1 square mile, it's 1 square mile now is 100 people, which is why you can get urban centers, cities, right? That's what this is. Urban centers are cities. Sedentary life and agriculture also leads to, let's see, we'll put it up here. It also leads to leisure because you have surplus, and surplus and leisure allows for specialization of labor, right? Which we have. We're not all farmers. Actually, most of us are not anymore. Now, the majority are still going to be farmers in Mesopotamia. In Sumer, one of the earliest city-states, right? It's going to get less as time goes on, but in Sumeria, around 90% were farmers. But that 10% now, in hunting and gathering, everyone had to be doing it. You had to be producing to survive. Now, with farming and agriculture, you could have a percentage of the population that focused on other things like art, building, technological development. And this almost always leads directly to the technological developments and advancements. All right, so urban centers then is the cities. Then you have usually social class that develops. So, that's like having the upper class, the wealthy, the poor, slaves, things like that, that just separates people from each other. So why urban centers. But, and you know, I could draw an arrow from agriculture, but then it's going to start to get messy, so we'll leave it at that. But why urban centers leads to social class and agriculture? Because ultimately you have a surplus, you have more wealth, you have more people. They don't always have to specialize in the same thing, which allows for some people to become wealthier than others. Land ownership is a part of this as well, and that is a big thing. The only main components, by the way, just so it's not confusing, are the ones I'm boxing in. All these other things are just subsets that, you know, were domino effects of that. So, you know, for example, what was the significance about the components of civilization? Well, that one, it tells us what was necessary for something to be a civilization, but it also shows us all these other things that it led to. But if, like on the test, I had the components of civilization, I don't expect you to write all of these smaller ones. I do expect you to know the ones that are boxed in. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It would be good to know a couple so you could talk about larger significance, was it led to these things as well. But the main ones you need to know are the ones I'm boxing in. I'm just giving you kind of these smaller subsets that take place with it. So urban centers lead to a social class where you have wealthy, where you have the poor, where you have distinctions in society. The next one then on the list, and this is where it gets dicey. The next three can come in any order. Organized, and we'll say centralized government. Okay, remember I talked about how hunting and gathering societies didn't have organized government? Well, that's one of the changes that develops because of this. And these go on the heels of organized religion and organized economic system. And again, 4, 5, and 6 here they're not don't take this as gospel, if you will, for the order, because it really does depend on the civilization. And even the society, right? Because we saw with Jericho and Çatalhöyük, how they were developing these things. So just because it just meant that these three things kind of developed around the same time. So 4, 5, and 6. These are important because what we can do with these is we can attach how all three of these interact with each other. The reality is that organized government and religion usually develop around the same time because they use each other. Organized religion reinforces government control, and usually organized government reinforces organized religion and the leaders, right? So they essentially work together to con the people a little bit. They work together to make sure that you can control the population, right? You need the population to get behind a system of government. You need the people to get behind an organized system of religion, in many cases for order, for agreed morals and justice of a society. So if they work together, it becomes mutually beneficial. Likewise, economic structure tends to this leads to, if we're looking at subsets for here, this would be trade, long distance trade, as a big aspect of that. But it also can be like with a barter system, and just a general economy. And usually religion and government are the ones controlling the economic structure in many cases. And then lastly, and you could argue, some would argue very most important, in terms of what it provides us an understanding of a population, is writing. Okay, and writing, right, leads to records. I mean, it's what we call history and literature, religious texts. And early on, a lot of the times, organized religion is directly connected to writing because being able to write down your religious texts and your tenets and your beliefs is important and helpful. The centralized government, too, can lead to, sometimes military is put on this list. I'm going to put it here, but I'm not going to box it up because here's the reality. You don't technically need to have a standing military of any kind to have a civilization. Most do. Because they need it for protection and control. But we'll see, like the Minoans are a perfect example. They were a civilization, and they had no standing military because they didn't need one because of where they lived, which was on an island, and their trade was so valuable people weren't going to invade them. A lot of the time, though, you see it arise at the same time as all of these components, okay? So this is the graph, the visual graph, we'll call it, of components of civilization, kind of the key things that are important for it to be determined to be a civilization. So hopefully what you notice, if you go back and pay attention to Jarmo, Jericho, and Shatal Hayuk, look at what are these components do they have? What are they missing? Right? The Shatal Hayuk, it has almost all of these, but they do not have writing. And they aren't technically an urban center, so they're missing those too. So see, urban centers don't always have to come second. They just often do with agriculture, especially once civilizations are developed. So loose order of how it works. And I'm probably being more generous on what an urban civilization is. But technically, Shatal Hayuk was not large enough to be an urban center because this is based on population. Right? And they didn't have writing. So they were missing those two components. Jericho was missing a few more. And Jarmo was missing a good number of these, right? So each one gained more and more components of civilization. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at with that development, because I already talked about the geography and what was changing with climate, we're going to look at the development of writing. And what was going on with that, since that's the last real main component, right? The urban centers just developed because of an increase in population, but you have the actual development of writing that takes place that makes Uruk that first city, and Mesopotamia the first civilization. So the earliest types of writing were the bulla and the cylinder seal. So we're gonna talk about those first, and then we'll talk about how it shifts. I'll put the third one up, Cuneiform writing. Okay, so these were the three kind of developments. Now, so I put them all up there now, and I'm gonna redo here. There's a loud car going by. So the bulla were essentially clay hollow balls, and we'll look at the pictures in just a minute. And then they usually had markings on the outside, and these were specifically created to record livestock, land, right, goods. It was more of a mathematic economic tally than writing. This is loosely writing. It's the beginning of writing. It's not writing in the sense of there is no sentences or you're not writing a letter with the bulla. It literally was created because we're we've got all this land. I've got all this livestock. I need to keep track of it because if I sell it or I buy more, I need to know what I have. And so they created this system. But it did have problems. So we'll look at that in just a second. The other thing, these both happened at the same time, okay? So that's why I'm going to put both of them first, and then we'll look at the pictures. The cylinder seals were also created around the same time. So you have the bulla, and then you have the cylinder seals. The cylinder seals played a different role. These were carved etchings, right? Carved etchings. That might be might not work together, but whatever. They were etchings that were carved into cylinder-shaped rock usually. I mean, it could be lapis lazuli, which was seen as kind of a precious gem. We'll say stone. Stone's the better word for that. And it had the carvings were usually images that reflected your family. So if you were king, there was more likely to be, references to hunting and power and wealth and control. But your family name might have a reference to a certain type of animal. This was very common that animals were figured a lot. You did also have myths, the stories, there are some of their epics, and gods as well. But for the average person, you tended to have something etched into it that was a visual representation of your family. And then it had a hole through the center so that you could wear it, basically as a necklace. And the reason for this is that this essentially was a signature. It was your signature. What you would do with this is you would take wet clay and you would roll the cylinder seal on it, and it would imprint the image. And I mean, these actually created very cool pictures. If you check out the bonus lecture, which is on Mesopotamian art, which I did for another class, but is valid to what we're talking about here, it's not required, but if you want additional information that goes with what we're talking about here, or you're interested in the art of it, we get into a lot more detail with the art in that lecture. I'm not going to test you on like the art specifically, but you will see some of the information overlaps. Like I'm talking about it now, you'll just see more examples in that lecture. The images were really pretty cool, and like I said, are kind of an artwork in of itself. But they would, you'd wear it to, and when you went to work, it would be like your sign-in for the day. Another example of this is that there were building inspectors in Mesopotamia. And so once a building was built, you had a building inspector like they do today, but with way less regulations, I'm sure, and they'd come inspect it. If they deemed it good enough to be sold, they would put a strip of wet clay on the inside of the door frame, and they would roll their cylinder seal on it, as basically signing off that that building was inspected and deemed safe for sale. You also later, when cuneiform tablets were created, when they wanted to hide the content of the tablet, they would put like a wet clay envelope around it. It wouldn't cover you'd crack the envelope once it dried, and then inside would be the cuneiform tablet. So you'd put this loose wet clay thing where the tablet could still shake around inside. Before it dried, you would roll the cylinder seal over the seam to show that it was sealed, and then it would harden just in the sun, or by just by being out in the open air, and then it would be delivered to the person, and the seal would show that it hadn't been looked at. So they had a lot of uses. Here's the thing: what happens is that eventually the bulla, they stop using it, and when we look at it in a minute, you'll see why. It's not practical. Whereas the cylinder seal, this continued a long time. In fact, if you think about the cylinder seal, eventually becomes, so you have this cylinder here, right, that had the hole in the middle and had we'll just pretend, right, those are the etchings on it that you would roll. Then what would happen is that people who couldn't afford, because these could be expensive to have commissioned, because not everyone was an artist. And then what you had is what was like a little stamp. So it was about this size, and it had a hole through it, and then the image was on the bottom in this kind of shape, right? And the image would be right here, and it'd be this was usually a single image, right, where this was a multi-image thing. And then from there, you later have the signet ring, right? 3. So then it would be a ring, and then on the top was the stamp, and it was initially signet ring. And it went from where it would be stamped in clay to through Queen Elizabeth and after, you used wax, right? So and then you later have one that's like a stamp that looked like this, right? So I mean, these are long standing, and then the image was right there, and that one used wax as well. So this is the cylinder seal, and its evolution of it continued on. It did not end. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back and look at the evolution of cuneiform writing, which is actual writing, right? These other two are kind of like early development structures and styles. So this is the bulla. Okay, so right, it's the clay ball. You usually had these tokens that were inside. They have them on the outside here, and you'd sometimes have some on the outside, but the idea is you'd build this, and you'd put these inside. Some had holes that they could add them to, others did not. And you can see like these inscriptions very lightly on here. You can see them a little bit more here. What's the problem with this system, right? So this is just an economic system to keep track of my goats and my acres of land, right? But let's say and the different ones tended to represent different things, and you can make them whatever you want. This is goats. This was, the circle was grain. Okay, so this represented grain, and these represented goats, and these probably would represent so many, pounds of grain. Anyway, I put it in my bulla. Then I decide I'm going to sell my least favorite goat. I don't like this goat. He's a pain. He headbutts me all the time. Bye, goat. So I sell him. But how I need to now not have this in my bulla to keep track. Plus, I guess I could this was created and the etchings were done when the clay was wet. They didn't carve into stone. So I guess you could scratch it out like that. But how do you get this out? You break it. So then what do you have to do? Now I have to make a new bulla. It's like having a piggy bank, and every time you want to purchase something, you have to break that piggy bank to get the money out, and then you have to build a new piggy bank. It's not efficient in any way. It's a fine first system of tally and economic recording, but it sucks long term, which is not surprising why they were like, yeah, screw the bulla. We're going to go on to something else, because it was just annoying. Now, these are the cylinder seals here, right? And you can kind of see they have it tied down in this, whatever this example is, but that's where the hole is right there. And you'd put a string through it and you just wear it. And you can see the etchings on there. This is a sample, but what they did is they took the wet clay and they literally just rolled it over the clay, and it creates these awesome scenes. And they could be hunting scenes. Again, there's a lot with animals, gods, and myths, and other things that tended to represent the family. Ones with kingship often showed processions with the king sitting down and attendants, serving and or other governors and other people, giving them things, because it was meant to show their power over other people. Hunting scenes were very common because that represented power. And so you get these, like I said, these pretty awesome works of art, and there's more examples if you go through the Mesopotamian art PowerPoint or listen to the lecture. So this one stayed around, and then just evolved into all those different types. The bulla they got rid of. Now the next thing is cuneiform writing. There are 3 phases of cuneiform writing. The first is pictograph. And pictograph just means picture or image, right? And the early pictograph was mostly the economic records. It really was a replacement for the bulla. Okay, and the problem with pictographs, though, was that these hieroglyphs are pictographs. When we get to Egypt, people are very familiar with the term hieroglyphs hieroglyph. I can speak. Because Egypt tends to have some of that more in popular culture with the hieroglyphs and whatnot. But it's the same thing. It's a pictograph. It's a picture. It's an image. And the problem with this is that it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So, for example, in a pictograph, if this was my pictograph, that it meant sun, right? And that was it. It was a sun. There was nothing else. So what are the limitations with pictograph? Well, one, I'm not going to write complex thought with it. I can't. There's not enough symbols for me to do so. The other issue, and well, this will be more an issue with the next one, but there were always lots of characters or symbols, right? You're going to get in the next series with ideograms over 3,500 symbols. I mean, some with the Chinese characters, you have a lot of characters because those started off as pictographs as well. So right, you lots of symbols, no complex writing. So you don't have letters, you don't have that. It really still was these two things here, right? It was an economic record, but people wanted more. Once they started being able to do a little bit more than the Bula, where they could actually write out basic not ideas even quite yet, but like I could at least express something if I had a picture of a person and a sun, and then, it's like emojis. The pictographs are like early emojis. And then, so you're trying to like write out, imagine, you're writing a story, or the administrative notes for a government thing with emojis. It's difficult. If you all agree upon what they mean, you can get some ideas, but you're not writing complex sentences with emojis. You might get an idea across, but there's no complex thought going on in the larger scheme of it, where you could write out your deeper inner feelings with emojis. Well, that's what this is here. So the second one goes a little bit further with ideograms because people wanted more. They're like, well, this is great, but how can we do more? Well, right, it's in the title here with this. The ideogram is idea, pictograph is picture. So with ideogram, it's now that the symbols they represented an idea, not just a 1-to-1 ratio. The signs are also, or symbols, I'll keep it the same. The symbols become shorter. You have actually several phases. One is that they are going to come shorter. They also turn sideways at one point, because it's one thing to draw a sun, a picture. It's going to be easier to do a little dash mark. How these were made, and I skipped that, I apologize. You used wet clay. You made a little square or rectangle of wet clay. You had a reed-shaped stylus. So here, we'll put it up here since I skipped it. Cuneiform, you needed a wet block of clay, usually in square shape. And most of the cuneiform tablets were pretty small. And then you had a reed wedge shaped stylus. So they had reeds, right, which is a plant near waterways, marshes, and they pulled it, and then they some were kind of naturally with the wedge shape. Others they would cut that way. So if here's my reed, then what you did is you had this, you would just make a mark like this. So it's like, I was thinking of it kind of like as an early fountain pen, but instead of ink going through, right, this was just, this shape here was meant to then make the indentations into the clay. So they use these two things to draw the pictures. And we'll see why it shifts to actually like signs or symbols later, because it was faster than drawing on it. So if we take the same symbol, the sun, with ideograms, which was a little bit later in time, right? Pictographs were first, and then it evolved into ideograms. Ideograms, you would have, it still represents sun, but what else can this picture now represent? Think about what else does a sun represent to people? Day, warmth, heat. light, right? And there's probably several other things as well. So now you can, what this allows you to do is it does allow you to express more. But there still are limits, right? What are those limits? It's not, you still can't express everything you can say. You can say or think. Right? There's limitations to this because you still only have so many ideas connected to a symbol. It also creates more symbols. As I mentioned, by this point you have about 3,500, which is more you have to memorize. And let's say, how do you make sure that someone doesn't get confused? You want to represent heat, like dangerous, hot, right? Or heat, here, I didn't put that one, hot. Like danger, don't touch, they didn't have they had a, fire stove kind of thing, but like, don't touch the fire. And then you have a warning symbol, hot. And then someone reads it like, oh, this is light. And that, I mean, it's a stupid example because they probably know what a fire is, but like, it's that idea, right? How do you clarify? No, I'm saying this is dangerous, this is hot, not that this is light. And you should have already known that. Like a lot of warning labels where you wonder who did that action for them to have to put that on the warning label. But the idea is, right, you had to clarify. Sometimes the context would be enough that you didn't. But if it wasn't clear, they had these prefixes essentially that you put in front of the symbol to indicate which one you had the idea. But it got all complicated and extremely complex. And then ultimately people were like, well, I still can't express everything I want to. This then moves to what is called phonetic or syllabic. Okay, and then this is where it's the syllabic adaptation. This is where it's now connected to the spoken word, right? Specifically with sound. So what you do, one is that what this allows you to do is anything you can think or say can now be written. So now you can have, this is where you get complex writing, which gives us, I will number these, literature, religious texts, law codes, administrative stuff, the boring like meeting notes and stuff, but it's good for historians, right? It gives you all of that stuff that you otherwise wouldn't get. So how does it work? Well, what they did is they took it, this is all where it also changes from a picture, right, from the sun to a symbol. So it went from that to where now a series of lines, and this is not one, I'm just making up some lines here, right? Here, we'll just go like that. Right, so that you have these kind of wedge shapes, although it had a little edge to it because it's a wedge shaped stylus. So they didn't look like just straight lines. But what you would do is, this was super fast. The picture, you had to take the wedge-shaped stylus and make the picture. This here only required you literally push down and up, push down and up. So this was faster, right? And this is the kind of the true development of complex writing. But how they connected it too is that, okay, if you're moving from sun to sun, what do you do with this? How do you do that? Well, what they did is basically every symbol represents a sound, right? This is how you make it connected to speech. And then instead of it being just an idea, you would put things together. For example, let's say you had a symbol that had the sound king, or two symbols that put together represented king. And then you had a symbol that represented ship. Well, you would put them together in the writing, not to get ship, to get kingship, right? I don't know the symbols to kingship, but that's what you do, right? So if you had a couple of symbols, but it's based on, this is all based on sound, right? And so that you can just create words. It's like hooked on phonics works for me. Probably I'm old. That represents how old I am there, as I still remember those commercials. Hooked on Phonics is all about sound and sounding out in order to spell and be able to read, right? So that you're saying out the sounds to merge it together to come up with it. Well, that's basically what this is doing, which is why it's called phonetic or syllabic. Okay, so that's the transition. Let's look at the cuneiform tablets for that. I mean, it's fascinating to think about, like, any writing in these early years went through these stages. That if with the Chinese, in India, in Egypt, they all had to do it. Later, as language and writing gets more complex and long-standing, you kind of see jumps in development where it doesn't necessarily have to follow these phases. But in the earliest 4 River Valley civilizations, they all follow this same stage. And I mean, it's super impressive to think about creating your own written system. So here we have cuneiform writing. With these, you should notice that this is a mix. I don't have one here, although I do in the art, Mesopotamian art. I have a cuneiform tablet in that one where you see pictographs. This is a mix. This is probably the ideograms, because what you're seeing a mix of, these look more like the like especially that one, and these ones are looking much more, that one's a great one here, like the characters, where it's just, this is literally 2 marks with the reed stylus. One there, right? Bam, bam. That's so fast compared to, all right, let me do this is probably the back of a reed stylus because it's a circle, but you're looking at the summer, you have to do the lines. Or when you have one of the other drawings where you're slowly drawing it out, these are much more complex. And then if you go over, this is definitely later cuneiform writing. Look at here's that wedge shape again, right? Where you're getting those marks. It's just quick, rapid marks. And that's how it transforms. So this is like number 2. This is number 3, and 1's still the pictographs, which we don't have a full pictograph structure of. And that's how it develops. It's very impressive with that. And you can see these lines. So they actually did it both ways, which can sometimes get confusing. Is that sometimes you'll see the lines go vertical, but they also would sometimes separate out cuneiform tablets horizontally. So it worked. Went both ways, and they have it blocked off, and so the sections, right? So you're moving through, or you could move down. And this is a good size sample. Now the Epic of Gilgamesh was huge. You would struggle to carry it on your own. These were like pocket-sized ones. It fit in your hand. Most cuneiform tablets, we have thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets. Most of them aren't translated because they're all economic records. Because again, still, what was the most important thing? Economic records for the average person. But they were also, you'd have these pocket-sized little notes. Let me just put a note on my wet clay for a second, hang on, and then you could carry them around and put it in your pocket and hand it off to other people. This was easier to store than like a massive cuneiform tablet. Now here, this is where I was talking about this transition. This shows you the dates with that to a degree. Again, everything that's still around this age is around 3200 BCE. So you can see here, right, these are going to be based on the pictograph and ideogram. Let me write that actually. And here they are simplifying it. It still looks like the head shape. And then by the time you have full cuneiform with the phonetic, right, it's just these marks. And that tip that I was showing right here, that's from the wedge-shaped stylus, because they're literally just pushing it in and out. It's fast, right? This is going to be the fast and complex writing, where it no longer is representative of pictures, but sounds. So this gives you a good idea of how they would do that. And some of these are ideograms. Like to walk is an idea. The head would be pictograph. Bird would be pictograph. Day would be pictograph. There you go. I should have just done that one. I should remember to just do that one for my representation of day, sun. Although, like I said, they do break it out. When you start, you would have one pictograph that would represent a lot of things. As it gets more complex in time, then you would separate out, okay, well, this is why you get more symbols. That's going to represent sun, and this is going to represent day, right? So that we know which one you're talking about. But then you just have to memorize a ton of symbols. So that's the development of writing. And that's that final thing. It's super important. Why is it important? Well, one thing that's interesting too with this is that the Mesopotamians created schools called adubas, which were, I'll write that down here. Let's put it, we'll just put it as 4 here. The adubas were scribal schools. So the first schools to develop were for teaching writing and for scribes. Both. What's fascinating with this is that both men and women, well, more men than anything else, learned to write. Women in Mesopotamia could write. We actually have letters from Babylonian royal women that were writing back and forth to each other. Now, you kind of had to be wealthier. If you were poor, you weren't going to scribal school. Okay, and women, if you were a man, you potentially could go to scribal school as like a lower middle class. There wasn't official middle class. I'm just giving it in terms of what we could think about in like wealth status. That they're more likely to scrounge and save for a guy to go to school because he could get a job in that versus a woman. But if you were wealthy, most Mesopotamian wealthy women or girls when they were younger were taught how to write. And we'll see later, women kind of are disregarded in that matter. So it is important when you have women's voices from their perspective of what they're writing versus just men writing about women, because it's not the same thing, and you're getting the experience of women through the lens of what men see them as versus when a woman's writing her own story. So at any time in history we can have documents written by women. That's a big thing, especially in ancient history, because they're so hard to find. So women could go to school, scribal school. These were connected to the temples, which we'll talk about. Women could also be priestesses in Mesopotamia, which was a big deal. And so you had a combination of temples and government, right? You went to scribal school either to kind of be a government official or to be part of the temple. Or wealthy families that just thought it was important for their sons or daughters to be educated and be able to write. But it was still pretty exclusive. But it is the first school system in the world. So that's also important. All right, we're going to look at we'll call this government structure. We'll just say government. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how you go from independent city-states. We're going to look at 2 parts. The first thing we're going to look at is the early democratic or republic government structure. It was more a republic structure to kingship. And then we're going to also look at independent city-states. All of, remember, Samaria, the Sumerian city-states were independent, right? They weren't one king over others, to what becomes empires, where you had one king controlling multiple city-states. So if we look at the first one, again, I get writing out this way, I kind of like giving a preview, but then I'm re-putting the early system of government, how it was structured, was not kingship, right? Contrary to what a lot of people think, Mesopotamia did not start off as kings. You had what was the Council of Elders. Actually, I don't need a number for that. We'll just put it. And I'll explain these here. And then you had the General Assembly. We'll start with that. So the Council of Elders, they were usually the ones that made up the laws, ran the government, did all the day-to-day structures, and functioned with the whole structure of government. The General Assembly were all citizens who would vote. write on laws and other things that the Council of Elders brought forth. The Council of Elders were elected. They were elected officials, essentially. What's unique about this, too, is it could be both men and women. So early on, this is a byproduct of hunting and gathering societies. The fact that you had such an equal-based society, early civilizations hadn't fully been moved to a strict patriarchal structure. They were starting to, but it took time to transition. And so women had a lot more active participation in society in the earlier years than later. So at the beginning, women could be part of the Council of Elders, and they were definitely part of the General Assembly. Everyone and all citizens could be part of the General Assembly, but there was a select few that were selected for Council of Elders. They think the Council of Elders came from elders, like when you had more chieftain tribes, and the elders were actually elderly people. Council of Elders doesn't mean they had to be old here. That just name kind of stuck with it. Then what you had was an inn. An inn meant lord, essentially, or leader. You had another title which was called lugal, which meant great man. We'll mention that one later. The inn, so the problem with this structure and any kind of democratic or republic structure is that if you had an emergency, it wasn't fast moving. It was slow. Like okay, we're going to put forth this motion, and then we're going to vote, and then we're going to discuss it before we vote. And then finally it passes. And oh, by the way, the flooding wiped out the town while we were all discussing what to do with it. Or there's an invading army. Okay, let's meet. Let's discuss. Let's petition. Let's vote. Oh, we're already taken over. You need someone who can act first. So the inn would, in an emergency, would be selected by the Council of Elders to lead. In Rome, they called this a dictator, but here it was the inn. So they weren't an official part of the government. It was meant to be temporary until the emergency, which didn't just have to be invasion, right? It could be flooding or drought or whatever, was over. Again, interesting enough, even with the title that we translate to Lord, at the very beginning, men and women could be inns. Okay? And then they had, we'll actually title these because that's all one. Then they had, again, the city-states were independent. However, they also still kind of identified together. So what's interesting with this is that they would meet collectively in what was called the Kinger League. And this was basically like a recognition of, hey, we should meet. They met in the city-state of Nippur. And it was kind of like the idea of, hey, we should meet to just discuss if there's any common issues that we have as city-states. And so once a year, an inn from each city-state would be chosen to go to Nippur. And basically Nippur was, each city-state had their own religious beliefs, but Nippur was kind of a known, more religious city-state. So there was no Mesopotamian religion in terms of one temple for all Mesopotamia. They all practiced the same religion, but each city-state kind of had their own thing going with what gods they emphasized and they had their own temples. But Nippur was seen as kind of like a holy city, essentially, so they agreed to, and it was in the central region of all of them. So they would agree to meet in Nippur for this Kinger League. Each city-state would elect an inn to go. And then they would basically discuss, issues that impacted them together. Sometimes that would be it, right? And great, we all agree these things are going. If there was a larger emergency, so something that threatened multiple city-states, then what they would do is that they would replicate what the city-states did, and the Kinger League would elect basically a lugal. And they were in charge of the collective city-states, but again, it was temporary. So there's this invading force, and it's threatening all these city-states. So the Inns that had all been elected to go to the Kinger League would then elect a lugal from those Inns, right? And that lugal then would be a temporary leader over all of the city-states that agreed upon this. And then that way they could all collectively fight a force. Whether it was a drought or flooding that impacted more than one city-state, or an invading force. And that person would do that, and then they would step down, and then all the Inns, were back to their own city-states. So that's how that worked. But we'll see how this kind of leads to, the shift to kingship. The other thing then that you had that was important, I guess we can put it with the Kinger League, is that each city-state had their own patron deity. So what's patron deity? Patron deity was essentially a god or goddess that looked out for their particular city. The belief was that god or goddess then would protect that city. They were responsible for the well-being of the city, and then that tended to be the god or goddess that city-state worshipped the most. Now again, Mesopotamia, we're going to look at it with religion a little bit later, but they're polytheistic, multiple gods. But you often favored certain gods over others, and each city-state had their own patron deity, which they favored the most. And this was connected to the Kinger League just in the sense that the belief that whichever person was chosen as lugal, their patron deity was technically also in charge of the gods at the same time, because they believed that heaven mirrored the earth. So whatever was happening on earth happened because of it was happening in heaven. Okay, so that's that. So how do we get from there to the shift to kingship, right? What changes? Because that's a pretty, significant shift in democratic structure to move to kingship. Well, one of the big things that happens is that you do have pre-kingship continual warfare. The issue was that there's no clear, strong borders. Right, you don't have any natural geography that blocks off and protects Mesopotamia from other regions. And so it's easy, they get invaded a lot more. And before you have strong kingship, they just were weaker areas to attack. So why does this change stuff? Well, it changes for several reasons. Because there was more constant warfare that kept increasing with the size of the population, and the city-states, that you ended up electing an inn a lot more, and occasionally a lugal more often, but inns mostly. Each city-state ended up having to elect an inn more frequently because they were under attack more often. Generally speaking, this elected inn would be male, because if you were being invaded, you're looking for the best warrior, and most of the time the best warrior was a man. What we see at the same time because of that is that women slowly get pushed out of the government. First, they stop being allowed to be from the Council of Elders. First, they actually stop being allowed to be inns, right? This monopolizes, what happens is that the inn position becomes only male. Then they get pushed out of the Council of Elders until eventually women are no longer part of the General Assembly either. And we actually know this because of what's called the sacred marriage rite. And the sacred marriage rite, and I'll show a picture of this in just a second. The older period, the early years, right, when you have the government where women were involved. So the early years when women, come on, now it doesn't want me to write it, were part of the government. Okay, when it was early years when women were part of the government, the sacred marriage rite, what it was a fertility rite. I'll actually put it up here. So you would do it once a year, and you would do this ritual it was meant to ensure fertility of the land, which is a good thing when you have agriculture. In the early years when women were still part of the government, what they would do is an inn was selected to do the ritual for each city-state. Okay? How we know that women were still being, and this could be a woman, and how we know that is because in the written records of the rituals and some of the pictures, a priest or priestess was chosen to represent the fertility god or goddess. So usually, fertility was goddesses and stuff, but in this case, they had a separate aspect for the representation of fertility. Could be a god or goddess, depending on, right, who was chosen. So if it was a female inn, then you had a priest represent the fertility god. If it was a male inn, it was a priestess, and it was generic. However, with the sacred marriage rite, later, with shift to remove women, and this is also, more warfare, you have a transition in the sacred marriage rite where you still have an inn was chosen to do the ritual. That didn't change. But what we end up knowing is that the inn was always male. So how do we know this? Well, because the fertility goddess, it became Ishtar. Actually, Inanna is the Sumerian. Inanna or Ishtar. Ishtar is the Akkadian name. Inanna is the Sumerian, and it was in both, right? She became the only, right, important with that, fertility goddess. She becomes the goddess of love, fertility, sex, lust. She evolves. But she starts off as a fertility goddess, but the only fertility goddess. So now the inn can't be female because it's only a fertility goddess. It's only Inanna or Ishtar, which is the same person, by the way. Inanna or Ishtar, here we'll put a line instead, right? They're the same person. It's just the Akkadian dialect versus Sumerian. So we'll just go with Ishtar, right? Ishtar is now the only fertility goddess represented in the sacred marriage rite, which means the inn has to be a man. Because what they did is they did a marriage ceremony. The ritual was a marriage ceremony. So you went through the ritual of marriage and then consummation of the marriage, which represented the beginnings of fertility. And so with this, we get this written and visual record showing how women moved away from the government. And then I'll show you the picture of that in just a minute. The last step was then, or the last couple of steps were, okay, so women get kicked out. What happens next is that, right, the inn essentially becomes the de facto military leader because they keep getting elected. You know, if they do a good job, right, then what happens is they keep being elected. And then at some point, they kind of probably just, what happens is they stay and rule for life. Probably at some point they're like, hey guys, you keep electing me as in, I keep being successful in these conflicts. How about I just stay in this position? I'm sure it was also put in like, for the good of the people, not because I want power. No. I'm doing this for you. But they did. They kept electing. If one military leader that was in did a good job, they were going to, of course, re-elect him the next time there was a conflict. And then eventually they kind of go, why do we keep bothering with elections? Just keep the position. So the temporary in leadership moves to permanent. But that's not kingship yet. What is missing? In order for it to be kingship, you need it to be hereditary, right? Where it passes down from the king or the in, which would be more like a dictator, to his son. As soon as it becomes hereditary, then it's kingship. At some point it was a slow evolution. You had ends that then got the position for life, and at some point one end went, I'm doing such a good job. I bet my son would do a good job. How about we just give it to him next, and we stop worrying about all this voting and electing each time, or when I die you have to pick someone else. I'll save you the trouble. We'll move it on to that. It's a smart. Now, they don't just move immediately to secular kingship. It actually starts out as a priest king. Because no, they weren't just going to accept as my example, I'll just become king and my son will take over after me. The people would have been like, that doesn't seem like what our government system is supposed to be. So what they did is that the early one, when you had the first kings, they actually took on a dual role. They were both king and head priest of that city-state, right? And why head priest? Because it provided a justification for kingship. What they could do as head priest, because the head priest was specifically a religious justification. What they could do as head priest is say, the head priest was kind of the one that communicated with the gods. They did all the rituals and rites for the gods. They also ran the temple. And so what they could say if you were head priest, in order to justify your kingship role, and say, look, I talked to the gods. The gods said they want me in this position. And by the way, we'll see this more when we talk about religion, but the Mesopotamian gods were not super nice. The main role of the priests were to make sure the gods didn't get pissed off at you. And so you could just be like, yeah, I'm the intermediary between the gods. And I talked to them, and they totally said, I'm supposed to be king. And if I'm not, they're going to be really angry. And so it created a justification for people to be like, oh, okay. And, whether they believed it or not, it allowed them to accept that transition. But this is two jobs. You are both king and head priest. The early priest kings lived in the temples. They ran the temples. They had to do all the daily obligations of a head priest. But you also then had all the jobs of king. It was a lot of work, right? The problem with this really was it was too much work. It worked initially to provide justification, but what happens is these priest kings started not wanting to do all this work. And once the new role of priest king had been around for a while, you didn't need the same level of justification that you had in the past. So, but the thing was, if you were to so here's what they wanted to do. They wanted to not do all the work, but have religious support and justification still. So how do you give up the head priest job to become a secular king, but maintain, so you don't have to do all the work, but maintain the religious justification, right? That became the conundrum. How do we shift from this. Priest king had to develop, so it goes from that normal government to kicking out women because of warfare, to ends being elected all the time, to at some point an end saying, I'm just going to stay in this position for life, to then starting to suggest the idea of it being hereditary, but in order to do that, they had to become priest kings. And then it shifted to, how do I become a secular king so I don't have to do all this stupid work? Because it really was. It's 2 full-time jobs, essentially. It was a ton of work. But I don't want to give up my religious justification because people don't challenge me and my rule if I have the gods behind me. So what they did is, as it shifted to secular kingship, they did a couple of things, right? The main job now was just king. However, they kept the most important religious rituals, which included the sacred marriage rite. So essentially, the king still was responsible for every year to do the sacred marriage rite, which was one of the most important. They also participated in the most important rituals and religious rituals. That helps some. However, the other thing that they did is that they made a family member head priest. Actually, most of the time, they made a family member head priestess. So it wasn't a man that was made head priest. It was most often a daughter, sometimes their wife, but the main one was a daughter. Because, right, your sons might become king. So you didn't want to become head priest because that prevented them from becoming king. So instead, what you did is you had your daughter become head priestess. And then she had the religious justification to back up your legitimacy as king. And then this is when you moved from the temples, where the kings lived in temples, to palaces, and palaces began to be built. So this was smart, because what you do is you really clearly establish a difference and say, I'm still going to hold on to religious justification through doing the most important rituals, and then my daughter is going to be head priestess, so she's going to guaranteed say, the gods want me as king still. But now I don't have to do all the daily work of a head priest, which was a lot of work. Like I said, there were a ton of things they had to do. They had to feed the statues. They didn't believe that the statues were the gods, but the god's spirit could embody the statues at any point in time. So they had to put food out for them. They had to entertain them. You had to play music. You had to run the whole priesthood and the economic aspect of it as well. But you also had a lot to do with the statues, of making sure if any point the spirit of the god was in the statue, that they weren't bored or hungry. So there was a lot of work for that type of thing. So this is how it transitions from government to women being removed, to priest king, to kingship, secular kingship, where it's the regular kingship. And once they've established that, that sticks. Okay, we're going to, I kind of skipped this part, that's fine, I'll just mention this. We'll talk more about this with religion, so this is kind of out of order for that, but that works. The Ziggurats were these, they were made out of mud brick from clay, and built into these foundational structures. And then what often was done is the temple was put on top of it. So the ziggurat is often, right here you can see, right, you have the temple part on top. They were very large structures, and because they were connected to religion and the temples, they were literally, at the beginning, in the center of the cities. As the cities grew, they kind of shifted in location, but they were not just physically in the center. They were the center of the city in many ways. They're kind of the lifeblood of the city. They were the priests and priestesses lived there in the temple on with the ziggurat. They often owned land and rented it out to people. They were one of the major economic long-distance trading hubs. They also had their own granaries for storing grain, for sale, and people could pay to store their excess grain. You had marketplaces that were at the Ziggurats that people went to. So they were the religious center, and early on, especially when you had priest kings, they were also the kind of economic political center as well, which makes sense why when people were transitioning to kingship and they wanted to kind of claim this justification, the ziggurat and living at the temple seemed like the perfect place because it was so central to the foundations of an industry of the workings of the city, economically, religiously, politically. And only when you shifted to secular kingship and palaces began to be built did those kind of shift to be the center of the city, if not physically, in every other way. But the temple still maintained throughout all of this owning land and renting it out to people, trade, marketplaces, and they still had a strong political connection because, as I mentioned, the king often had a daughter as head priestess of these temples. So this was a very characteristic classic architecture that you saw in almost every Mesopotamian city, was the ziggurat with the temple as the kind of central hub to their city. And this is one of the largest ones, the ziggurat of Ur, which is this too. What's left of it, but this is the reconstruction of it to see what it looked like. I mean, it was a big, imposing architectural structure, and it was meant to be, to showcase the power of the gods, to showcase the kind of power of the temple and the priests and priestesses, and not surprising that it kind of attracted that central interest, and then later aligned with the secular government to reinforce that type of justification and control. This is the one I forgot that those were in there first. Inanna, this is Inanna / Ishtar. Again, same person. She was the goddess of fertility, love, lust, sex. There was a variety of components with it. Fertility and love were her two main things, though. Essentially, like if you think of Aphrodite in Greek mythology, Inanna or Ishtar, which is just, again, her name changed, same goddess. Aphrodite is basically the same goddess as Ishtar, just the Greek version. So you have the fertility goddesses, right, in hunting and gathering society that basically evolved into a larger deity in Mesopotamia. This was the only main real female deity. Ereshkigal, who is her sister, which if you've read The Descent of Ishtar yet, is mentioned. She was a main deity in terms of power. She was a major deity, but she's not mentioned very often. Ishtar is in a ton of stories and literature. People like talking about her. She's an interesting character. We'll look at her when we look at the literature with Epic of Gilgamesh and Descent of Ishtar. So this is her. And this is who replaces the generic priest or priestess to represent the god or goddess of fertility in the sacred marriage rite. This was from a cylinder seal. Seal, but it was representing the sacred marriage rite. So the sacred marriage rite, as I mentioned, was very important. And what's interesting here, this is Ishtar. So how we know, one of the ways we know that women were kicked out of that is because, again, early descriptions of the sacred marriage rite have a god or goddess of fertility, depending on if the in was a woman or a man. When women were kicked out, you only see representation of the sacred marriage rite with Ishtar presiding over it. And she becomes the foundational component as the only goddess of fertility. There's no god of fertility anymore. It's just Ishtar. And she's the only one in the sacred marriage rite. So this actually showcases her being the only one, where then we know by this point when this cylinder seal was made, that women were not participating in the government anymore. I think that's the last one for that. Yeah. So just based on time, I'm going to split this up into two sections. So I'm only going to do one other thing, and then we'll look at the individual kind of regions with the Akkadian Empire, Third Dynasty of Ur, and Hammurabi, and the law codes and the religious stuff next time. So let's see. We are on 3, I think. Yeah. Well, this is still part of kingship, so let's put it with here. We'll do 4. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at today, just because of timing, I don't want to make this super, super long. So again, I'm just going to break this into two parts, is the components of what made up a good king in Mesopotamia. Now, some of these are definitely characteristics that other societies had, because they're kind of generic good characteristics of how to be a good person. But there's some that are specific to Mesopotamia as well. And this is important to look at and remember, because we're going to talk about it when in the next lecture, when I talk about Sargon and Naram-Sin and Shulgi and Hammurabi. And these specific kings, we're going to look specifically at those kings and whether they represented good or bad kings based on whether they fit this list, okay? And so when you kind of asked, right, that was one of the questions. So, like, what are the components of a good king, and how do you know what represented a good king or bad king? Well, it's from this list here. So a good king, one of the things was that he was a shepherd. And this fell under the idea of that the king was responsible for the people. The idea of the shepherd is definitely not a thing like in Egypt or China or even India. It is in some other societies and stuff. The shepherd definitely came from the smaller tribal chieftains and probably the early government, where they saw themselves as, they interacted with the people. They were involved. They saw themselves as protecting the people. And that's the second part that's very Mesopotamian. The kingship, the king was expected to be involved with the people, to be seen. A good king walked amongst the people, participated in rituals, talked with the people. You saw your king in Mesopotamia. The king was a shepherd, and you can't be a shepherd, like, if you can't, with your flock, if you aren't ever there. You had to be involved and to be seen. And like I said, that was very uniquely Mesopotamian. Others are going to develop it later. And we'll see New Kingdom Egypt, the king starts to be more seen. But the Egyptian pharaoh was never seen as a shepherd. They only start being more visible to justify their rule. But that takes all the way till the New Kingdom, when things start to decline. So like I said, that's definitely there. Now, another one was that they were the God's representative. Now, technically, the head priest or priestess was as well, but because they didn't want to give up that full justification, the secular kingship kept this idea that a good king represented the gods. Because they didn't believe in that, they definitely, Mesopotamians did not believe that the kings were gods. So we'll put kings were not gods themselves, but they were divinely chosen. And we'll see a bad king when we look at Naram-Sin. He kind of announces himself as a god, and that's a big no-no in Mesopotamia. You can be divinely chosen, but you definitely are not a god yourself. You are also supposed to basically make sure the gods stay happy. As we'll look at in the next lecture, the Mesopotamian gods were not very nice, and you really didn't want them pissed off at you or your city. So the king's responsibility was to keep the gods happy. He was the intermediary. He could talk to the gods, so could the head priest or priestess, but the king too. And the king's role then was to make sure that the gods didn't get pissed off at everyone. Then the king was also responsible for justice. Right? That's like the law codes. Making sure that you create law codes and keep people, safe from, we could put safe in two spots, right? In this case, it's safe from being taken advantage, right? And so you have the law codes to make sure that people are being treated fairly, that they're not being robbed or swindled. They also were protection, and this is where the military comes in, making sure not only as head of the military, but that there was a strong military for protection. This could be also building walls and buildings for defense. Right? You have to keep your people happy. The safer that the people are, the happier they are with the king. And then providing for the people. Okay, and then for providing for the people, this could be economic prosperity. then certainly the better off that the city-state was. Again, the happier people were. This also tended to be building projects. So we'll see Shulgi built basically what was a college. You know, the building projects enhance the city, and that can create economic prosperity. It can be providing for the people, making sure they have enough jobs and food and all of that. So these are the markers of a good king. And I kind of didn't go straight there with that. We're going to pretend. So a good king in Mesopotamia was that they were a shepherd, that they were God's representative, that they provided justice, protection, and providing for the people. Okay, that's where we're going to stop. I'm going to break it into two parts. Part 2 will be looking at the various empires and some examples of good and bad kings, Hammurabi, the law codes, and then in a separate one, which won't be very long, but just because so it doesn't make it any longer, I'm going to look over the primary source packet and do the readings with you so that hopefully those are clear. All right, so that will be its own separate lecture, but it shouldn't be more than a half hour just because I'm only looking at the primary sources.